this. Okay, so let's see if that happens. So what I hope you see is a web page for the Coastal Research Volunteers. And I sort of want to create a bit of a context for this in that we, New Hampshire Sea Grant has been involved in resiliency in a number of different ways, and we're now sort of moving in a direction to try and do more integration across the Sea Grant functions of communication, education, extension, and even to a certain extent research, and pull them together so that we're addressing different aspects of that issue. So it's not just an extension job, it's not just a communication job. And so one of the ways we're doing this is I'm working with my colleague Julia Peterson, who works very directly with the members of the Coastal Research Volunteer. I'm sorry, this is Allison's. I'm going to go back first to this one, to the Coastal Adaptation Work Group. That's Julia's. And the Coastal Adaptation Work Group is made up of planners and agency people and people like Julia in New Hampshire that are trying to address issues around resiliency. And I and the education aspect of Sea Grant had not been part of the work of Coastal Adaptation Group work group, but Julie and I talked about it, and we realized that the members of the Coastal Adaptation Work Group, or CAW, really didn't have the resources to be able to do the kind of outreach and particularly education that really would support significantly the work of the work group. So I joined the work group about, probably about a year ago, and we've been discussing how we can use the resources of Sea Grant education, and particularly UNH Marine Docent Program, to support really the needs of the work group in getting more fundamental conceptual understanding about the issues around resiliency to a broader public. And so we are in the midst of really coming up with some priorities and some planned outcomes, and obviously the strategic planning and all of that that goes along with that, with the idea that we can use the resources of Sea Grant education and the UNH Marine docents to begin to access a larger audience that really need to understand some basic concepts of climate change, the impacts of climate change in terms of frequency of storms, severity of storms, storm surge, things like that, in a way that the resources of the individual members weren't really able to address. So we're kind of at the beginning of that, and it would be kind of fun to do a year of it and then come back to this group and sort of say, here's what's worked, here's what hasn't worked. But that's really, for us, a bit of a strategic shift to do more integration of functions across Sea Grant, and also to really think more deeply about the kinds of information and awareness needs that the public needs to have in order for some of these issues to be understood from the point of view of decision making and supporting agencies and city officials as they begin to try and take action relative to some of the issues. So then there's the other group that I mistakenly head up first, and that's Alice Neberhardt, who's another colleague of mine, runs a group called the Coastal Research Volunteers. And this is, for those of you who may know, we had a number of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we had a group called the Great Bay Coast Watch, and it was run by Ann Reed. And it was a group of people that went out once a month and collected basically water quality data once a month, and we submitted that data to a database that was hosted by the state. And it was a very effective organization for collecting data. But with the advent of more effective real-time ways of collecting data, the Great Bay Coast Watch kind of became a bit archaic. So we let the Great Bay Coast Watch kind of die, and we're able to get some grant money to hire Allison and really start an effort that uses volunteers to work with researchers and with issues like resiliency to begin to do citizen science, collecting data, and also get involved in activities. one of those that Allison's been involved with recently is dune restoration on the New Hampshire coast. We have, as you all know, a very small and short coast, but we do have dunes that have been impacted by development, and as you all know, are clearly one of the pieces in the puzzle of how do we protect the coast and how do we protect our communities. So Allison has had a group of coastal research volunteers who are mostly adults who have time to volunteer, working on dune restoration. But a piece of that has also been working with schools and not only educating kids about sand dunes and what dune ecosystems are and how they function, but also getting them directly involved in not only data collection, but the restoration effort. So this is one that sort of, that will probably continue to grow in terms of the areas of resiliency where data collection, citizen science, and then potentially engaging students will work. And as I said, Allison and I are colleagues, and we talk often about potential projects. We have a research project that got funded that uses picture post, picture taking, and education of students in the estuaries to get them to understand estuary science better, but also to understand the role of estuaries in resiliency. So that's another one that there's probably going to be a fair amount of growth in over the course of the next few years. And then finally, we have traditionally offered in the UNH Marine Docent Program a climate change C-Trek, we call them. They are programs that we take into schools. They're generally geared toward the standard, 45-minute class with students. But one of the things that we've identified is, and this really relates to the work of the Coastal Adaptation Work Group, is that there needs to be a more effort working with non-traditional, non-formal education groups and opportunities. So we are essentially splitting off a group of our docents to work on some non-traditional, non-formal kinds of educational programming that will again start to address some of these basic conceptual understanding needs that really are at the heart of people beginning to make good decisions about how to respond to climate change and resiliency challenges. So that's kind of a third project. That's one I'm working on more directly. And it's interesting because we're exploring a lot of the work that's gone on out there in terms of social marketing and some of the best ways and best tools to use to try and get people to understand and then move from understanding to action, and certainly gearing that up and supporting that with other resources to try to address the problem. So those are some of the things that we're doing up here. And as I said, some of them are very new and early, and some of them we've been doing for a while.
Great, thank you, Mark.
I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Okay. So Joan, you're next, and I have yours to share. Hold on just a minute. Do you have a preference over which one I share, Joan? And you're going to want to unmute yourself so we can all hear you. Oh, can you guys see? Was I sharing? Let me try again.
My camera isn't in a very...
Okay.
Oh, well, if you have the poster showing, then it doesn't matter what I look like.
Okay. There's the poster.
All right. Well, I think it's really good, this order, following Mark, because some of what he said, especially in the third one, is relates to what you're hoping to be working on. But just to something that we've already done, we've done this for 2 falls now. We did it last fall, and this is the first one we did a couple falls ago. It's just, kind of a basic series of, workshops, seminars in the evening that focused, it was a combination of focusing on literacy, scientific literacy, about resilience, and then some really practical things that people could do. We had done a series in the past called The Green Home, and this was our way of covering resilience. And we got together with, you can see the different partners that we worked with to put it together. we gave away a weather radio to people who came to, a bunch of them and all. And it was well attended, and people liked it. You can see the last session was actually the speakers were telling what the towns were doing and what the county was doing, and kind of trying to build support from community members by knowing about that. And then we did it again last fall. I mean, I guess you can show that the next one if you want for that. Again, they were, they're well attended and all, but we wanted to go the next step. And because although our coastal training program is working quite extensively with all the municipalities and towns and organizations on Cape Cod to work on resilience issues more at the municipal and county level, we want to find out, like, where should our community education program, which is what I do, fit in resilience, because no one wants us to be working on this. And so to go further than these workshops. Also, we thought we're probably not. We're just hitting the people who will come to our place in the evenings and come to these programs. And so we got a little, it's called a capacity building grant, sort of an internal NEARS grant to hold a meeting. We'll be holding it in the end of April with the other organizations on the Cape who are already working on these issues, and to use a community-based social marketing approach to kind of find out where should we be focusing on, what are the behaviors or the actions that we want people to do, what are the audiences that we should be focusing on, and where are the gaps that we can fill. That's why we're getting the other people in the room. And then once we pick a population or a group to work with, we'll have a focus group with that group. And again, look at messaging and what exact activities are we planning to do. So this sounds very similar to what we just heard. And so I guess I was glad when Amy asked, because I would be interested to hear, any thoughts that other people had. And we're also struggling with, are we just going to go for increasing understanding and more scientific literacy about these resilience concepts, or are there specific behaviors that we're looking for? And also when I ask that, it comes to, make an emergency plan, make a emergency, get an emergency kit. And so is this like the role the NEAR should be playing, or is Red Cross already doing those types of things? So we're hoping with this process to kind of figure out what our niche is. That was all I was going to present, kind of what we'd already done, and then that seems like we're going in a similar direction, and that Mark is, and I'll be interested to hear if we can share, ideas that way. I liked some of your ideas with having volunteers actually working on projects and things like that.
Thank you, Joan. Thanks a lot. Rachel, are you ready to share about the living shorelines?
Sure. So I have a few slides that are kind of my go-tos for just introducing the concept of living shorelines, and so I'll share those. See if is it sharing? Can you see a PowerPoint?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me go ahead and hit the PowerPoint. So I feel like it's really hard to talk about living shorelines without talking about shoreline hardening more broadly, because you have to kind of have what the contrast to what a living shoreline is. And so when I talk about shoreline hardening, especially, even in the scientific community, I have to define, like, what do I mean by shoreline hardening? And so I just put up some pictures of different types of hardening. So the seawalls and bulkheads, this is actually a seawall that's in Swampscott, Massachusetts, right near where I used to live. And riprap revetments, this is a rock structure. It's basically any kind of artificial structure we're using to harden the shoreline, protect it from wave energy, from storms, from flooding. So that's kind of the traditional approach for how we've tried to protect our shorelines. This last picture is a breakwater. That also falls in the category of a traditional approach, kind of an offshore artificial structure. The difference being with this particular photo is that it could also be considered a living shoreline because it includes a natural component. So you see marsh there. So that's kind of the background on living shorelines. Is living shorelines are supposed to be an alternative to our traditional approach of protecting our coastlines from erosion or wave energy or whatnot. So some of the work I've been involved in, or I've kind of focused on over the last several years, is getting a handle on shoreline hardening in terms of ecological consequences and also extent. This is an infographic that the Pew Charitable Trust created based on a paper I led back in 2015, which basically just gave us a baseline of how much of the shoreline in the United States or the continental U.S. have been hardened. And so I like their infographic. They're way better than I am at creating pretty graphics that are easy to understand for like the general public. So instead of showing some of the more complicated graphs I have, I put this one up here. But the point here is just to give some context that, we're not talking about huge percentages in terms of total shoreline, but when you consider how much shoreline the United States has, and we're talking about estuarine, we're talking about tidal riverine, we're also talking about your open coasts, we're talking about a lot of coastline that's ultimately been hardened. The total across the whole U.S. is 14%. That's about 22,000 kilometers. So we are modifying our shorelines a lot with the idea of protecting people and property. And so there's a lot of opportunity potentially to do this a bit differently and make our shorelines a little more resilient. And that would be by using living shorelines. In terms of resiliency, I think about resiliency not just in terms of people and property, but also ecologically. So are we sustaining a lot of the ecosystem services that we want to sustain with our shoreline protection options? And so this was a synthesis I did for first year of my postdoc up at Northeastern, where I looked at all of the data out there, all of the published literature on the ecological effects of shoreline hardening on different organisms. And the main takeaway from this, there's a graph and there's lots going on here, is that you have an overall negative effect of seawalls in particular. So there's vertical concrete or rock walls on organism biodiversity and also the abundance of marine organisms we have along our coastlines. And so we really do want to be shifting away from this like kind of common, standard engineering approach and move to, more hybrid solutions like those breakwaters that I showed earlier. So the alternative to shoreline hardening, it's a big buzzword now, is living shorelines. This is a NOAA definition. I'm sure everybody's seen this or has seen a living shoreline at this point. There's a lot of different types. I show 3 examples from North Carolina just to show the variety of structural materials you can use. So the top picture is a marl sill with some marsh planting. The center picture is granite rock with marsh. And the bottom picture is actually a living shoreline that I helped construct, which is just out of loose oyster shell. We have intertidal oyster reefs in North Carolina. So we're actually able to build it out of natural material. And so that was right after it was constructed. But essentially a living shoreline could be any kind of shoreline that includes natural components. The key is it has to have some kind of natural feature and it's maintaining the continuum of the natural shoreline. You're not putting a wall or drawing a line and going from natural to built without any transition. And the other aspect of my research over the last several years has been to actually verify that what we're calling living shorelines are actually sustaining the services we want them to provide. So we know we don't want a seawall or bulkhead because there's lower abundance of organisms, there's less structurally complex habitat. We know we would rather mimic more of a marsh shoreline in the center where you're getting higher diversity of organisms. You've got a structurally complex habitat like a marsh for those organisms to occupy. What we didn't know until I did some research in graduate school was whether or not this living shoreline approach that combines marsh planting and also some kind of artificial structure would actually function equivalently to a natural shoreline, or perhaps even enhance that natural shoreline. And so what I found in graduate school was that yes, in fact, at least the sites and the types of shorelines I was studying, we could in fact mimic the natural shoreline condition, and also even provide additional habitat when we constructed these living shorelines correctly. So that's kind of the summary on that. The other side of resiliency that we've been focused on, I think, with most of this call is resiliency in terms of people and property. And so the other study that I did, main study I did in grad school, was actually looking at the performance of these living shorelines during a hurricane event. So this is Hurricane Irene in 2011. It came right over North Carolina while I was a grad student and did a fair amount of damage to the majority of the coastline. And so I surveyed a lot of different shoreline types and assessed damage pre and post storm. So there's a paper related to this, but I won't show the graphs. I'll just show two adjacent properties that were affected by Hurricane Irene. So these two properties are about 500 meters apart along the same shoreline. The top picture is a bulkhead. So this is your traditional shore protection approach. The bottom is a living shoreline that was actually just planted right before I took this picture. So the marsh is not even fully developed yet. And then there's as you can see, a rock structure kind of offshore, providing some wave attenuation. And then this is after the hurricane. So this is actually the day after the hurricane hit, Hurricane Irene. The water level is still high from the storm surge. It's supposed to be low tide. It's actually not. The bulkhead completely collapsed. The property owner lost approximately half their property. I think when he filled it back in, it was 22 dump truck loads of shoreline that was lost and had to be put back. The living shoreline property owner didn't have any loss of shoreline. I took elevation measurements, marsh density measurements. They basically had no effect of the storm. The only real damage they suffered was other people's bulkhead parts and docks washing up onto their shore. So they had to pay someone to come and remove that debris. But this shoreline really held up, and it's actually held up really well in 2 additional hurricanes afterwards. We've been continuing to monitor these sites. So that's kind of what I've done related to living shorelines. It's mostly been North Carolina centric in terms of the field work. Now we are kind of getting involved more in the citizen science aspect of things, and also in just kind of working with waterfront property owners. So I have a project right now where we've surveyed waterfront residents, and we're trying to figure out if we can use information they provide us about their shoreline, about how they manage their shoreline, what they're experiencing in terms of erosion, perceptions about habitat loss, and whether or not we can kind of combine that with our field data and develop a method that allows us to integrate waterfront residents with scientists so that we have this kind of network of people that can kind of real-time provide data, particularly pre and post storm event, on the condition of their shoreline and the performance of their property through a storm. We're expanding into more like the coastal flooding issues with some newer proposals that we're thinking about putting in. This is in collaboration with Stephen Cyphers, also Brian Helmuth. We may be putting in a proposal this year more focused on flooding at Northeastern. I'm actually transitioning to a faculty position down in North Carolina next year, but I'm still trying to stay involved with the Northeast, particularly because Northeast is just moving to kind of living shorelines in the last month or two. So, or not month or two, a couple of years. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Rachel. I forgot to introduce you as a current postdoc up at Northeastern University.
Yeah, no problem. Let me stop.
And those are pretty impressive pictures before and post Hurricane Irene.
We actually have one, a grad student working with the UNC has one post-Hurricane Matthew, because Matthew was the most recent hurricane to hit North Carolina and do some damage. But Irene actually did a lot more damage than Matthew. So those are probably the two most impressive pictures we have so far.
Well, thank you. That was really informative to me, I know. So we're going to open it up now to a discussion. I don't know if anybody has any questions, if you'd like to ask each other questions, or if anyone listening has any questions they'd like to ask. And then I'd like Holly to introduce this possible Coastal Resilience grant program that she found yesterday.
I actually have a question for either Joan or Mark, just because you guys both said you were looking at the social side of things. I was just curious, and if you guys are familiar from the with the work that Jay Baker, who I thought he was at the University of Florida, and I was just looking to see if he was still there, and his website, the page was no longer active. But he did a lot of work, in case you're not familiar with him, he did a lot of work looking at pre and post Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey and the perceptions that were there, and working with, well, this is actually good for everybody, and working with coastal populations, and he also, a paper came out, actually I can share it because I just found it. He also did work, I'll share my screen if that's okay, Amy. This is another paper that came out, and they compared, they were looking at 2012. So they were looking at Hurricane Sandy and then Hurricane Isaac. So it's very interesting. I'm not going to make everybody seasick, but when you look at these two maps of where these storms hit, Isaac was a very interesting storm because the communities it impacted have been impacted previously, obviously, by Katrina and other storms. It's a very common area that gets impacted by hurricanes. And then, of course, Sandy, there was all of the hoopla with what it was being named and how the forecast went, and then the communities that it ended up impacting in New Jersey and Long Island. But it's very interesting that these two groups, if you read through the paper, that they ended up having very similar responses to what they thought was going to happen, their perceptions. Even though one group is obviously very familiar with hurricanes, the other group doesn't get hit that often, they still thought that the worst thing coming at them was the wind, and they had no idea that they need to be concerned with the water, even though the water could have been right outside their doorstep on the other side of the sand. So I recommend, if you guys are looking for good information about perceptions and risk perception and societal responses, look at Jay Baker's work. This is one that was in BAMS, which I forget what that stands for. But I can send out these links, Amy. I can either share them on Slack, or I can give them to you if you want to send them out. There's a couple of different papers. This was another one that came out. I think this is actually, Robert Meyer is at the University of Pennsylvania. So these are folks just to share. This is from what we know, and we've seen them present before, but they have a lot of really good information if you guys are looking for it for societal perception stuff.
Thanks, Holly. That would be great if you could share that, because I hadn't heard of those before. Thanks.
Yeah, it's pretty compelling when you read through it. It's kind of, I don't want to say ridiculous, because I don't want to be obtuse to things, but to see how people who live on the coast and have the water right there, to not even understand that was the biggest risk that was being posed to them, and they still thought that no, it's the wind. And then the other interesting thing was, even though this was 2012 that they looked at, so 5 years ago, even though at that time people were still looking to the television for their information with regards to hurricanes and predictions and forecasts. They weren't looking at the internet. So I don't know if that's changed now, but it was still 90% of the population was looking at the TV as their source of info. That was the other thing that sticks with me from his presentation he gave one time that I saw.
Yeah, it's interesting up here where I had a graduate student a year ago do some work interviewing here in New Hampshire. And as you can imagine, because most of us are in the same area, the fact that we haven't been hit with a hurricane in a while is sort of bad news in the sense of getting people to pay attention to some of this. And we've been exploring that issue of, how do you get people excited about something that hasn't happened in a while? How do you, we've had a lot of impacts of heavy 100-year storm kind of flooding. So inland, in fact, there's a lot more attention being paid, we found in work than some of the coastal stuff. So that's been something we've been taking a look at is that sort of challenge of getting people to take it seriously at all. And given the fact that, we often only get sort of the remnants of any hurricane, and people are used to heavy rainstorms, but they're not used at this point for a while in a hurricane.
We had a lot of discussion about that when we were planning our little course series. And one thing that we decided to focus on were past storms, even if they were like 400 years ago, but that people would believe that it can happen here if it's happened here before. So the presentations included information about, past storms, not just predicting, because sometimes people don't think you can predict what's going to happen. So, yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, on the Hurricanes website, before Sandy, that was actually, we lost power here in Narragansett during the storm for like a good week after, but the Hurricane website, our hurricane history, we have a whole section on historical storms, went off the charts. Like that was a section people were actually, and that's what we find, we've actually found that that's what happens is before a storm, that's the part of our website that gets hit the most often, not the preparedness, what do I need to do, but, what did past storms do and what happened? So it's very interesting that people are actually doing that. They're looking at historical storms and wanting to know what happened previously. So I think that's really interesting. And then the other thing is, Mark, the opposite of when you have an area that's been hit a lot by storms, but sometimes the forecasts are it's gonna hit somewhere and then it doesn't. And the same thing happens up here. People become complacent. So then it's this whole battle you have, and this is what forecasters and what the National Hurricane Center folks deal with is how do you make people believe what they're saying is gonna happen and take necessary action? And I think the work that you're doing or that all of us are doing just to get people a general awareness so that they do take things seriously, and actually do what they need to do to be prepared, even if it doesn't happen, I think is another critical thing to try to work around.
So we see this in North Carolina and in the Southeast a lot. Like I've lived in the South my whole life. I've been through many, many hurricanes. People feel very prepared for the short-term impacts of hurricanes. Like I think, you're just used to it. But what I'm finding with the surveys of waterfront residents here is that they're not prepared for the potential changes long-term and how hurricanes are going to impact their property relative to like sea level rise or more intense or more frequent storms. So when we ask them how they're going to change, their behavior or how they're going to modify their property, if sea level rise is X amount or, they get more frequent storms, overwhelming majority say they'll do nothing. Like they're not expecting to have to change, that things are going to be the same way they were for the last 30 years. Or they say, well, by the time it affects me, it'll be my grandkids, it won't be me. Because we're working with mostly retirees that live on the water here. They've lived here for a while and, they've got the money that they can just rebuild if they want to. But there's really no movement to change. It's just kind of hold the line. And we've only really seen small storms in the last decade or so, Category 1 hurricanes, and they've done a lot of damage, but people just rebuild the same way they always have. That bulkhead owner, the picture I showed him a living shoreline. I was like, look, you can save all this money. You already have the natural slope. And he spent $20,000 and rebuilt his bulkhead because he thought it would make his property value go up. So, yeah, people are stubborn.
Well, I think the best example is in Texas after Hurricane Ike. The entire seawall pretty much got tossed up and onto, or all the structures, a lot of the buildings that were historical, all this different stuff that was along the edge, not so much inside the historical area that also flooded, but the storm surge that carried everything up and over. The crazy thing was, I can't remember the name of the developer that owns most of the hotels in Galveston, but he built this huge pier that now has a roller coaster and a Ferris wheel at the end of it. And I was like, you must have one heck of an insurance plan. But it's like, you live in the Gulf Coast. The most deadliest storm has hit Galveston that we know of. You know, that was 1900s. But you're going to put a Ferris wheel and a roller coaster out there, and it's likely that you will probably get another storm in the next however many years. So I hear you. It blew my mind when that happened after Hurricane Ike. So.
Holly, would you like to share now about the grant?
Yep, I can definitely do that. So this is, I'm just going to share my screen. To make life easier, I just basically started copying and pasting from the grant website, which I know that, oops, that's not what I wanted to do, which I know Amy also had sent. So of course, it's got to go this way. Okay, so it's the Coastal Resilience Grant Program. It will be for fiscal year 2018, and again, this is out of Massachusetts. So this will be one of those things that if we decide to look at this from a NEOSEC perspective, how it will work for groups that aren't in Massachusetts, because of it is geared towards the 78 coastal municipalities that are in Mass. But there is a website for it. It's administrated by the Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management Office on behalf of the Massachusetts Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and it's all acronyms. It's awesome. I think it's typical. And it's managed by CZM Storm Smart Coast Program. So, which the website is there. So there's a whole lot of words, but basically the key things here is it's funding for coastal communities. So the 78 municipalities located along the Massachusetts coast, which here they all are. And this is available on their website if you want to know which one's which, or if you want to zoom in, but those are the ones that they're considering. And looking at to reduce risks associated with coastal storms, flooding, erosion, sea level rise, through a lot of different initiatives. And so the nice thing is that there's a lot of different aspects to what makes you eligible or what projects would be eligible. And interestingly, when we've looked at a lot from the hurricane science project, looking for different proposals, because we've been trying to find funding again for our project. A lot of times there isn't a public outreach a section specifically identified. And this grant, as well as the previous NOAA grant that was announced that had the deadline back in March, had a public outreach component that was actually separate, or at least listed separately. So it's one of the projects that you can do, but there's also an increase, so that's increasing awareness and understanding of climate impacts, but then there's also this non-structural or green infrastructure approach to storm damage protection, which I think goes along with what Rachel was talking about with the living shoreline. So I think this is, again, a Massachusetts push to perhaps look into that further. So again, the grants are for fiscal year 2018, and they don't have the funds yet, so they're anticipating they'll come out and they'll be released. In fiscal year 17, they awarded over $1.8 million, and you were able to request up to $500,000 in funding. They did, in looking at past grantees, they did give out a fair number of grants. I didn't look to see what the major number was, but there was a fair amount funded each year, and they've been doing this. They had like 4 or 5 years listed. They've been doing this. There is a match, so it's 25% of the total project cost, but the nice part of this is that it could be in-kind contributions, not just monetary, not just a monetary match, which I think is actually a little easier to work with when it comes to something like this. So these are your eligibility, the projects that are eligible. So you've got vulnerability and risk assessment, public education, communication, local bylaws, adaptation plans, and other management measures, redesigns and retrofit, and then that natural storm damage protection. Under public education and communication, the thing that they said at the very end of their piece, and they're describing these, which is pretty standard, but they said creative communication products that provide ongoing benefits and can be adopted by other communities are strongly encouraged. So I think that's where the collaborative aspect of NEOSEC and the scope that we have and the different groups we can engage, and scientists and educators, I think that's where, when it comes to this type of component, we'd be really well positioned. That being said, I went and looked at their past projects and was searching for education, and there were actually only a limited number of projects that had education initiatives, and they were mostly community education programs, and they are almost always part of another restoration effort. So then again, NEOSEC, as we just heard about all these different groups and we're doing different things, I think we're again well positioned because of the work that's being done. I know there are other groups in NEOSEC, other members that are doing other coastal resiliency projects and research that couldn't participate today. So again, it's the beauty of NEOSEC, and that we have all these different members doing great things that we can then access potentially. So even though the RFP hasn't been released, or RFR, they are hosting these 3 information sessions. So obviously we didn't go to the one today from 10 to 12 in Ipswich, but there's another one on April 10th in Wareham, but then Amy, there's one on the 13th in Boston at the McCormick building. I don't know where that necessarily is, but it may be interesting. I'm assuming that it's Trish Bowie, right, Amy? I think that's what it was, who you had invited to talk. And she is listed as one of the main contacts on the grant proposal website. But just to give us an idea for deadlines, last year's deadlines, it looks like the applications were due by June 6th. Then they were pretty quick turnaround. The awards were estimated to be announced by July 15th, and then awards were actually announced on the 17th of August. But it looks like the funding was for a year, and the projects needed to be completed before June 30th. So I put that there so we just had an idea for a potential timeline. So that's kind of what I parsed out of the website and the announcement itself. I think it's going to be a potentially very interesting opportunity per se, if it's something that we want to look into. But I think reaching out to Trisha or talking would be to figure out if it's something that we might be able to even explore, because of the fact of not everybody involved would be Massachusetts, if there could be subcontracts to other groups or something like that. I don't know.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, I had invited Trisha Bowie to be part of this conversation. She's the Coastal Resiliency Coordinator for Mass CMZ, and she was really interested. She just had already had something booked at this time. But so she'd like to be engaged in conversations that we have in the future about this, and I think that we should continue talking about this. It's 1:58, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time and not to go overboard. Did anybody else want to comment real quick on what Holly just went over?
So I just wanted to put in a quick comment. Obviously, I'm not in Massachusetts anymore, and so I'm not saying this might be the best thing for me, but North Carolina, I've been involved in living shoreline training workshops for real estate developers, marine contractors, the general public, on how to construct or different options that they can use for their private property or for their future developments, or they can recommend to waterfront homeowners. We've been doing these as in-person trainings in North Carolina through NC but the webinar, the hurricane preparedness webinar, got me thinking that perhaps there's a kind of a need to do a webinar-based approach where you can kind of have specialized trainings for different regions of the country in terms of how to do some of these, more natural alternatives. We have a variety of people involved in these workshops, from scientists who are kind of right on the edge of like the newest techniques, but also like practitioners who are actually building, permitting people for the different state agencies, and also engineers who are actually, building a lot of these structures. And so maybe that's something that could be proposed for Massachusetts, is like a series of webinars to actually train people on the options and how to maybe go about pursuing a living shoreline as opposed to a traditional technique. So that's just a thought. I mean, it's something that's being done in other places, but maybe hasn't been done in Massachusetts yet.
I think that's a great idea. Considering there's 78 potentially coastal municipalities in Massachusetts, and there's no way you could reach out to all of them, have an in-person meeting. Even if you just have something in the Cape and something in the Northeast and something in the more southern aspect, not necessarily out in the Cape, it becomes a challenge because you're still asking people to travel to certain locations. So I think that if you've had a really good response with the in-person ones that you've been doing in North Carolina, I think that would be great. And if you can have a broader scope, that's always a bonus.
Yeah, we have, and we've applied for funding to do more of them in the future. But one of the problems we've run into is getting to the people who are in the more rural parts of the state. So they do one workshop in the central, southern, and northern parts of the state. But a lot of the marine contractors, for instance, they can't travel and take off that time from work to do it in person. So, but the people who have come, it's been overwhelmingly positive in terms of the feedback they've gotten. So I think, webinar and bridge might be good. And if somebody does decide they want to go that route in Massachusetts, I'm happy to link you to the NC NEOSEC site. They've posted all of the trainings online, I think, and the presentation.
Yeah, and our coastal training program also just recently hosted actually the coastal service centers from the Digital Coast, the green infrastructure workshops, and they were like so popular. They sold out really fast, one on the Cape and one in, I think it was in Natick. So I think there is a lot of demand for learning about that in Massachusetts. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining today. Sorry about my voice, but I hope that we continue this conversation. And NOAA also has a coastal resiliency grant that comes up every year, and that what got Holly and I talking about who should we bring together in NEOSEC to put together a grant like this, and who's doing what. So I think this is a great start to the conversation to try to find out who's doing what and what we can do. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good weekend.
You too.